If the man who signed your birth certificate also signed the order to let you die just to steal $15 million, what would you do? I heard my father tell the doctors to let me pass because he would not pay for the surgery. He treated my life like a line item on a balance sheet, unaware my lawyer was recording every word. I did not scream when I woke up. Instead, I destroyed his $500 million empire in 24 hours. My name is Gemma Carter, and at 34 years old, I was no longer a daughter to the man standing at the foot of my bed. I was a liability. I was a depreciating asset in a portfolio that was about to go public. I was floating in the dark, suspended in the terrifying, rhythmic limbo of the intensive care unit at Central Lakeview Medical Center. My body was a broken thing, wrapped in wires and tubes, breathing only because a machine forced air into my lungs. To the casual observer, I was unconscious. To the medical staff, I was a Glasgow coma scale of 6, teetering on the edge of catastrophic brain swelling, but hearing is often the last sense to fade, and in my case, it was the first to sharpen. I could not move my fingers. I could not open my eyes. I could not scream, but I could hear the hum of the ventilator, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, and the voice of the man who had taught me everything I knew about business, my father, Dr. Leonard Blake, CEO of Blakeline Health Alliance, did not enter my hospital room the way a father visits a dying child. He entered it the way he entered a boardroom during a hostile takeover. The door did not creak open with hesitation. It swung wide with authority. He was not alone. I could hear the rustle of high-quality wool suits and the distinct, heavy footsteps of men who bill by the hour. He had brought his legal counsel to his daughter's deathbed. He did not touch me. There was no warm hand covering mine, no brush of fingers against my forehead to check for fever. No whispered prayers. I was lying in the flagship hospital of his own empire, a building named after his father, and yet I felt entirely like a stranger to him. I heard him exhale, a short, sharp sound of impatience. Dr. Renee Calder, the attending neurosurgeon, began to speak. Her voice was tight, professional, but laced with an urgency that cut through the fog in my mind. She told him that I had sustained a severe traumatic brain injury, a subdural hematoma with a significant midline shift. She used words like aggressive intervention and decompressive craniectomy. She told him that time was the only currency that mattered right now. Leonard cut her off. He did not ask if I was in pain. He did not ask if I could hear him. He asked about the return on investment. He asked what the realistic prognosis was for a full cognitive recovery. He used the phrase persistent vegetative state as if he were ordering it from a menu. Dr. Calder paused before answering. She told him that with immediate surgery, I had a 70% chance of meaningful recovery. She said I was young. She said my vitals were strong. She said the brain is resilient. 70%. In the business world, you kill for 70% odds. You bet the company on 70%, but Leonard Blake was not looking for a win. He was looking for a write-off. He asked about the timeline. He asked about the cost of long-term care facilities. He asked about the optics of a CEO having a brain-damaged daughter during a merger. Then he asked the question that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He asked what would happen if they did not operate. He asked what would happen if they simply let nature take its course. The room went silent. The only sound was the mechanical hiss-click of the ventilator breathing for me. In the corner of the room, unseen and unacknowledged by my father, sat Avery Cole. Avery was my personal attorney, my friend, and the only person in the world who knew where all the bodies were buried. 3 years ago, when I first started uncovering the rot inside Blakeline, I had signed a durable medical power of attorney. I had notarized it, filed it, and given Avery strict instructions. If I was ever incapacitated, she was to be in the room. She was to be my voice. And most importantly, she was to record everything. Avery cleared her throat. I could imagine her shifting in the uncomfortable hospital chair, the small digital recorder in her lap capturing every syllable. She introduced herself as my patient advocate. Her voice was steady, steel wrapped in velvet. She reminded them that she had legal standing to be present. Leonard dismissed her presence with a scoff. He called it overkill. He called it ridiculous. He turned his back on her and focused his attention on his own lawyer. Graham Holt. I heard the rustle of papers, thick, heavy bond paper, estate documents. Leonard asked Graham to clarify the terms of the trust. My mother, Elena, had left me $15 million in a trust fund that was locked tight until I turned 35. I was 34. The money was tantalizingly close, yet legally unreachable. Leonard knew this. He knew the bylaws of that trust better than he knew my birthday. Graham Holt lowered his voice, but in the silence of the ICU, it carried like a shout. He explained that under the specific clauses my mother had written to protect me, the money remained in the trust if I was alive and competent. However, there was a reversion clause. If I were to die without a spouse or children, the entire principal sum of $15 million would revert to the original grantor's estate. Since my mother was gone, the executor and beneficiary of that reversion was Leonard Blake. But there was another clause, a darker one. If I were deemed medically hopeless, if I were declared permanently incapacitated and requiring life support without brain function, the trust could be dissolved to cover medical costs, with the remainder flowing back to the family estate to be managed by my father, alive and healthy. I controlled the money in 11 months, dead or a vegetable. Leonard controlled the money today. Leonard did not hesitate. He did not ask for a moment alone with me. He did not weep. He made a calculation. He told Dr. Calder that he did not want me to suffer. He used the word mercy. He said that I was a proud woman, a woman of intellect, and that I would never want to live as a shell of myself. He lied to the room, and he lied to the air, claiming he knew what I wanted. He said to let me pass. He said they would not pay for the surgery. I tried to scream. I tried to command my lungs to fill with air on their own, to force a gasp that would shatter his narrative. But the paralytics were too strong. I was a prisoner in my own skin, forced to listen as my father signed my death warrant. He asked for the forms, the do not resuscitate order, the refusal of emergency surgical intervention. Dr. Calder protested. She argued that this was premature. She argued that 70% was a number worth fighting for. She argued that I was responding to stimuli earlier that morning. Leonard shut her down. He told her that he was the next of kin. He told her that he controlled the insurance policy. He told her that he would find another doctor in the system, a doctor who understood the concept of feudal care, if she refused to comply. He threatened her career without raising his voice. I heard the scratch of a pen on paper. It was a sharp, scratching sound, like a rat clawing inside a wall. That signature was not just ink on paper. It was a theft. It was $15 million stolen from a daughter who was still fighting to live. It was a declaration that my life was worth less than his merger, less than his ego, less than the liquidity he needed to cover his bad debts. Avery sat in the corner, silent now. I knew why. She had the recording. She had the evidence of him refusing life-saving treatment for financial gain. If she intervened now, if she revealed the full extent of what she knew, he might backpedal. He might spin it. She needed him to commit. She needed the ink to be dry. It was a gamble of terrifying proportions, trusting that the doctors would find a loophole, or that she could file an emergency injunction before my brain swelled to the point of no return. Leonard handed the clipboard back. He sounded relieved. He sounded lighter. He asked Graham if the transfer could be initiated as soon as the status was official. Graham murmured an assent. They began to move toward the door. The business was concluded. The meeting was adjourned. I felt a surge of cold rage so powerful it felt like it should have set the bedsheets on fire. It was a primal, electric jolt that bypassed the damaged circuits of my brain and fired directly into my nervous system. I hated him. I hated him with a clarity that I had never possessed when I was awake and whole, and in that moment of pure, distilled hatred, my body disobeyed the coma. My right index finger, resting on the stiff hospital sheet, twitched. It was not a tremor. It was a spasm of intent. It curled inward, scratching against the fabric. A nurse, standing near the monitor, gasped. She said my name. She said, "Look." Leonard stopped at the door. I could feel his gaze turn back to me. The nurse pointed at my hand. She said I moved. She said it was a purposeful movement. She looked at Dr. Calder with hope. Leonard stood there for a long second. I could not see him, but I could feel the weight of his stare. He was looking at his daughter, who was supposed to be dying. He was looking at the obstacle between him and $15 million. He was looking at the complication that could ruin his merger. He did not rush to my side. He did not call out my name. He turned back to the door. He told the nurse it was just a reflex. He said it was the body shutting down. He said not to give false hope. He opened the door, and the sounds of the hospital hallway rushed in paging announcements. Cartwheels, the hum of life continuing outside my tomb. Before he stepped out, he spoke to Graham, his voice low, intended only for his lawyer, but caught by the sensitive microphone of the device in Avery's lap. He said that by the time the merger closes, this will all be over. The door clicked shut. He left me there to die. He left me to suffocate in my own trapped mind. He walked away believing he had just secured his empire and solved his cash flow problem. He had no idea that the machine was still breathing for me. He had no idea that Avery was already saving the audio file to a cloud server, and he had no idea that the 70% chance Dr. Calder spoke of was about to become a 100% probability of his destruction. I lay in the dark, the rage keeping me warmer than the blankets. I made a promise to the rhythmic beep of the monitor. I would not die. I would not fade. I would wake up, and when I did, I would not be his daughter anymore. I would be his reckoning. 3 months before the semi-truck crushed my sedan, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor of the Blake Line Tower in Riverton, Illinois. The city looked like a circuit board from up here, gray and gridlocked under the perpetual Midwestern overcast sky. Inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive cologne. My father, Leonard, sat at the head of the mahogany table. He did not look like a man who was planning to murder his daughter. He looked like a man who was annoyed that his daughter was reading the fine print. He slid a stack of documents across the polished wood toward me. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, the kind used for official philanthropic endeavors. At the top of the page, the logo for the Blake Hope Foundation for Medical Advancement was embossed in gold leaf. It looked noble. It looked charitable. But I knew better. I was the Director of Compliance and Legal Affairs, a title Leonard had given me thinking it would keep me busy with rubber-stamping regulations while he played God with the company finances. He had severely underestimated my ability to follow a paper trail. I placed my hand on the stack of transfer requests but did not pick up my pen. I told him that I could not sign these. Leonard did not blink. He asked me why not, his voice carrying that dangerous, quiet calm that usually preceded a storm. I pointed to the third item on the list. It was a transfer authorization for $5 million to an entity called Nexus Biologistics. I pointed to the next one, a transfer for $10 million to something called the Archer Medical Group. I told him that I had run due diligence on these organizations. I told him that Nexus Biologistics was registered to a residential address in a strip mall in Delaware, and Archer Medical Group had no website, no board of directors, and no published research papers. These were shell companies. They were ghosts. Leonard leaned back in his leather chair, tenting his fingers. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain, the way one looks at a child who is crying over a broken toy. He told me that I was being too emotional. He said that business at this scale required flexibility. He said these were strategic partners for future research and development, and that sometimes, to get ahead of the market, you had to secure relationships before the public details were finalized. He called it visionary. I called it embezzlement. I pushed the papers back toward him. I told him that money from the charitable foundation could not be moved into private holding companies without a declared grant purpose. I told him it was illegal. I told him it was money laundering. Leonard stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city he believed he owned. He spoke to the glass. his reflection ghosting against the gray sky. He told me that I was just like my mother. He said that Elena never understood scale. He said she thought small. He said she thought saving one life was a victory, whereas he knew that building an empire saved millions by default. My mother, Elena Pierce Blake, had been the brilliant mind behind Pierce Therapeutics. She was a scientist, a healer, a woman who built a pharmaceutical company because she wanted to cure pain, not monetize it. When she married Leonard, she thought she was gaining a partner who could handle the business side while she focused on the science. Instead, she had invited a wolf into the fold. When she died of ovarian cancer when I was 22, the wolf took over the den. But Elena had been smart. She had seen the greed in Leonard's eyes long before the end. She had left the majority of her personal fortune, along with a controlling block of non-voting stock, in a trust for me. $15 million. It was a staggering amount of money. Enough to ensure I never had to work a day in my life. But she knew Leonard would try to bully me out of it, or charm me out of it, so she had locked it down tight. The terms of the trust were ironclad. The principal was untouchable until my 35th birthday, which was now only 8 months away. Until then, I received a modest stipend, but the bulk of the capital sat there, accumulating interest, waiting for me to mature enough to defend it. However, there was an exception clause, a clause designed to protect me, which Leonard knew by heart. The money would be released early only under 2 conditions. 1, if I died, in which case the trust dissolved and the assets reverted to the family estate, meaning Leonard. 2, if I became permanently incapacitated, defined as a state where I was a medical burden without hope of cognitive recovery. In that scenario, the trust would convert into a custodial fund managed by my legal guardian to pay for my care, with the residual control going to the guardian. That guardian would be Leonard. At the time, sitting in that conference room, those clauses felt like dry, dusty legalese. I never imagined they were the blueprints for my assassination. I just saw them as the reason Leonard looked at me with such frustration. I was the lock on the vault he desperately wanted to open. I stood my ground that afternoon. I told him I would not sign the transfers. I told him that if he forged my signature, I would report it to the IRS myself. Leonard turned from the window. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He told me that I was not built for real business. He told me to go home and rest, that I looked tired. He dismissed me as if I were a secretary who had brought him the wrong coffee. That evening, I went to the family dinner at his estate, a sprawling mansion in the suburbs that felt more like a museum than a home. The dining room table was long enough to seat 20, but it was just the 3 of us, Leonard, me, and my half-brother, Ethan. Ethan Blake was the chief financial officer of Blake Line. He was 30 years old, handsome in a soft, unformed way, and perpetually terrified of our father. He sat across from me, swirling a glass of expensive single-malt whiskey, staring into the amber liquid as if it contained the answers to his problems. Ethan was weak. I knew it. Leonard knew it. And most painfully, Ethan knew it. 6 months ago, he had come to my apartment late at night, sweating and pale. He had made some bad private investments, crypto schemes, and high-risk tech startups that had imploded. He was in debt to people who did not send invoices. I had loaned him $1.5 million from my personal savings money I had inherited from a grandmother, separate from the main trust, to bail him out. He had promised to pay me back within the year. He had not paid back a cent. At dinner, Leonard cut his steak with surgical precision. The knife scraped against the china, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He started the interrogation. He asked why I was constantly siding with the nursing unions regarding staffing ratios. He asked why I insisted on keeping the nonprofit clinics open in the South Side when they were bleeding revenue. He looked at me and asked why I could not be a team player. He asked why I did not support the family business. I looked at Ethan, hoping for support. As CFO, he knew the numbers. He knew that cutting nursing staff increased liability lawsuits. He knew the nonprofit clinics gave us tax breaks that exceeded their operating costs. But Ethan just took a large swallow of whiskey and looked down at his plate. He would not meet my eyes. He was a man with a $1.5 million secret and a desperate need for his father's approval. He was useless to me. I put down my fork. I told Leonard that without the nurses, there is no business. I told him that patients are not just data points for his quarterly earnings call. Leonard laughed. It was a dry barking sound. He told me that was exactly why I would never run this company. He said I lacked the stomach for the hard choices. The hard choices were all leading up to one thing, the merger. It was the deal of the century for the Midwest. Blakeline Health Alliance was preparing to acquire the Triaxis Care Network. The deal was valued at $500 million. It would create a healthcare monopoly across 3 states. Leonard would control everything from urgent care clinics to specialized neurosurgery centers. He would be the most powerful man in the industry. The signing ceremony was scheduled to take place in 3 months at the Regency Crown Hotel. It was going to be a coronation. Leonard was obsessed with it. He was leveraging everything to make it happen: company assets, personal favors, and, as I was beginning to suspect, illegal funds from the charity foundation to cover holes in the balance sheet so the audit would look clean. I knew the company was overextended. I knew Leonard was desperate for liquidity. But I did not know how desperate until much later. I did not know that he had borrowed against his own equity to fuel this expansion, and if the merger failed, or if the stock price dipped, he would be ruined. He needed cash. He needed a massive infusion of capital to keep the house of cards standing until the ink was dry on the Triaxis deal. And there I was, the daughter with the $15 million trust fund, refusing to sign the papers that would let him dip into the charity pot. I was the obstacle. I stayed at Blakeline for one reason only. It was not loyalty. It was not love. It was protection. Every night, after Leonard left the office to schmooze investors or terrorize his country club friends, I stayed late. I sat in my office with the door locked. I did not just review contracts. I copied them. I was building a shadow archive. I worked with Avery Cole, my personal attorney and the only person I trusted implicitly. We had set up a secure, encrypted server that was completely separate from the Blakeline network. Every time I found a suspicious invoice, a duplicate ledger, or an email instructing a hospital administrator to upcode a diagnosis for higher insurance reimbursement, I made a copy, I scanned it, I uploaded it. I told Avery that we needed an insurance policy. I told her that if Leonard's greed ever caused the company to collapse, I wanted to make sure the fallout hit him, not the thousands of nurses, doctors, and janitors who worked for us. I wanted to make sure that when the ship went down, I had the lifeboats ready for the innocent, and the anchor chain wrapped around Leonard's ankle. I felt righteous. I felt smart. I thought I was playing a dangerous game of corporate chess, and that I was winning because I had the moral high ground. I was so naive. I thought the worst thing Leonard could do was fire me. I thought the worst thing he could do was sue me. I thought we were playing by the rules of business cutthroat. Yes, but bound by laws and norms. I did not understand that when a narcissist is backed into a corner, when his legacy and his fortune are threatened, he does not see a daughter. He sees a resource to be liquidated. I sat in that office night after night, staring at the glowing screen, cataloging his financial sins. I felt a grim satisfaction as the file grew. I thought I was holding a sword over his head. I did not realize that while I was building a case, he was calculating the actuarial tables of my life expectancy. I did not realize that the $15 million sitting in my trust fund, the money my mother left to ensure my freedom, had become a bounty on my head. To Leonard, that money was just sitting there, stagnant, useless, attached to a daughter who asked too many questions and refused to sign the right papers. He looked at the reversion clause, the one that said, if I died or became a vegetable, the money was his to manage, and he started to do the math. I remember one specific rainy Tuesday, a week before the accident. I was leaving the office late. The elevator doors opened in the lobby, and I saw Leonard and Ethan standing near the security desk. They were arguing in hushed tones. Ethan looked sick. His face was gray. He was shaking his head, pleading. Leonard had his hand on Ethan's shoulder. It looked like a comforting gesture from a distance, but as I walked closer, I saw the grip was tight enough to whiten the knuckles. Leonard was not comforting him. He was restraining him. He was controlling him. They stopped talking when they saw me. Leonard's face smoothed over instantly into a mask of paternal indifference. He asked if I was working late again. He told me I should be careful driving home in the rain. He told me the roads were slippery. At the time, I thought it was a throwaway comment, a rare moment of generic fatherly advice. Now, looking back, I wonder if he was already visualizing the crash. I wonder if he was already imagining the twisted metal and the shattered glass. I wonder if he looked at my head and saw not a brain full of memories and legal expertise, but a fragile container standing between him and the liquidity he needed to close his deal. I walked past them, out into the cold rain of the parking lot. I got into my car, the same car that would be destroyed in 7 days. I checked my phone. I had a message from Avery confirming that the latest batch of incriminating files had been successfully uploaded to the Shadow Archive. I texted her back, "We have enough. After the merger, we go to the board." I thought I had time. I thought I had the upper hand. I drove home, thinking about justice. I drove home, thinking about how I would save the company from my father. I had no idea that in the executive suite, my father was likely pouring a drink, looking at the financial projections for the Triaxis merger, and deciding that a tragic accident was a much more elegant solution than a shareholder revolt. He needed $15 million to plug the hole in the charity fund before the auditors for the merger arrived. I had $15 million. The math was simple. The morality was non-existent. And I, the director of compliance, the woman who prided herself on seeing every trap, never saw the truck coming. I never saw the betrayal coming. I was too busy looking at the numbers to realize that to my father, I was just a number too, a number that needed to be subtracted so the equation would balance. It was a Tuesday night in early April, the kind of Midwestern spring evening that feels more like a relapse into winter. I was driving back from a 16-hour contract negotiation in the city, heading toward the suburbs of Riverton. The rain was relentless, mixing with sleet to turn the asphalt into a black mirror. My windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle, slapping back and forth in a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding of a headache behind my eyes. I remember checking the clock on the dashboard. It was 11:45 at night. I was exhausted, my body running on caffeine and adrenaline, but my mind was still replaying the clauses of the vendor contracts I had just redlined. I was driving a heavy, safe luxury sedan, the kind with a 5-star crash rating that my father insisted all executives drive. He cared about safety ratings because they lowered corporate insurance premiums, not because he worried about the people inside the cars. I was on the highway connector, a long, curving stretch of road that offered a panoramic view of the Riverton skyline. To my left, dominating the horizon, was the Blake Line Tower. The logo, a stylized blue pulse line, glowed against the dark clouds. It looked like a lighthouse, or perhaps a warning beacon. That was the last thing I saw clearly. The truck came from nowhere. It was a shipping container semi, its brakes failing on the slick decline. I did not hear a horn. I only saw a wall of blinding white light flooding my rearview mirror, growing larger at an impossible speed. The physics were brutal and instantaneous. The truck clipped my rear bumper, sending my car into a violent, uncontrollable spin. The world dissolved into a chaotic blur of wet glass, screeching metal, and the terrified scream of tires losing their grip. My car slammed into the concrete divider, rebounded, and rolled 1, 2, 3 times. The airbags detonated with the force of a shotgun blast, filling the cabin with white powder and silence. As the car came to rest upside down, crushed against the guardrail, I caught one final fragmented glimpse of the Blake Line Tower through the shattered window. It seemed to be moving away from me, retreating into the night, abandoning me. Then the darkness took over. Later, my legal team would recover the dashcam footage from the vehicle behind me. That video would become crucial. It showed the truck swerving, the impact, and the lack of brake lights. It was irrefutable proof that this was an accident, not negligence on my part. It was the shield that would eventually deflect the rumors Leonard tried to plant in the press about me being drunk or suicidal. But in that moment, lying upside down in the wreckage with blood pooling in my hairline. I knew nothing of evidence. I only knew the cold. I was airlifted by helicopter to Central Lakeview Medical Center. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The helicopter bore the Blake Line logo. The trauma center I was wheeled into was funded by the profits my father had squeezed from insurance companies. I was being saved by the very machine I had spent 3 years trying to reform. According to the medical logs, I arrived with a severe traumatic brain injury, multiple rib fractures, and a collapsed lung. But I was alive. Crucially, my brainstem was intact. Dr. Renee Calder was the attending neurosurgeon that night. She was a woman of immense skill and even greater integrity, one of the few senior doctors who had not been bought or bullied by my father's administration. She examined me immediately. She ordered scans. She tested my reflexes, and she wrote a note in my chart that would become the most dangerous sentence in my father's life. She wrote that the patient has a 70% chance of meaningful recovery with timely surgery and aggressive neurocare, 70%. In the world of traumatic brain injury, 70% is a miracle. It is a number that demands action. It is a mandate to fight. It means the person inside the broken shell is still there, waiting to be pulled out. Dr. Calder ordered the operating room to be prepped. She paged my father as the next of kin to give consent for the craniectomy to relieve the pressure on my brain. Leonard Blake did not answer the page. For the first 3 hours after my accident, while I lay in a medically induced coma, balancing on the razor's edge between life and death, my father was unreachable. He was not asleep. He was not traveling. He was in a private dining room at the University Club, holding an emergency strategy meeting with the board of directors and his financial advisors. When the news of my accident reached him, he did not rush to the hospital. He paused. He assessed the situation. He realized that the news of the CEO's daughter being critically injured could spook the investors for the Triaxis merger. It could be seen as a distraction. It could weaken his bargaining position. So, he stayed. He spent 3 hours managing the narrative before he bothered to manage his daughter's survival. He instructed his PR team to draft a statement about family tragedy, while he finished his brandy and assured the bankers that the deal would proceed on schedule regardless of personal matters. When he finally arrived at the ICU, it was nearly 4 a.m. The hospital wing was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft tread of night nurses. Leonard walked in flanked by his personal attorney, Graham Holt, and a junior corporate counsel. He did not look like a grieving father. He looked like a man arriving at a property inspection. I was unconscious, but my hearing was processing everything. The brain is a strange recorder. It captures the tone, the vibration, the malice, even when the consciousness is offline. A nurse approached him, her voice hushed and respectful. She told him that I was stabilizing. She told him that I had shown a pain response when they set the IV line. She told him my pupils were reactive. These were victories. These were signs of life. Leonard brushed past her. He did not walk to my bedside. He did not look at my bruised face. He walked straight to Dr. Calder, who was reviewing my scans on a digital lightbox. He asked her about the costs. He did not ask if I would walk again. He did not ask if I would remember him. He asked about the long-term financial exposure of a patient in a persistent vegetative state. Dr. Calder stopped what she was doing. She turned to him, her face tight with controlled anger. She explained again that I was not in a persistent vegetative state. She repeated the statistic, 70% chance of recovery. She explained that with the surgery, I could return to a high level of function. Leonard looked at the scans, staring at the white bloom of the hemorrhage on the dark background of my brain. He asked what the quality of life would be if the 70% failed. He asked about the 30%. He asked if I would require 24-hour nursing care. He asked if I would be a vegetable. Dr. Calder admitted that there were risks, but emphasized that the indicators were positive. She handed him the consent forms for the surgery. She said they needed to move now. Leonard did not take the pen. He turned to Graham Holt. He asked his lawyer, right there in the room where his daughter lay fighting for air, to clarify the terms of the trust. Graham whispered, but in the silence of the ICU, it was a shout. He reminded Leonard that if Gemma survived but was incapacitated, the trust would be locked into a custodial arrangement. But if she passed away, or if the medical team deemed her condition hopeless and care was withdrawn, the funds would revert to the estate, to Leonard, $15 million. That was the moment Avery Cole stepped out of the shadows. Avery had arrived 2 hours before Leonard. She had been sitting in a chair in the darkest corner of the room, a small, unassuming figure in a trench coat. She held a leather briefcase on her lap. Inside that briefcase was the document that authorized her to be there, and inside her pocket was the device that was recording every second of this betrayal. She stood up. She walked into the circle of light around the nurses' station. She placed the durable medical power of attorney on the counter next to the surgical consent forms. She told them that she was my designated agent. She told them that the document was notarized, filed with the state, and active immediately upon my incapacitation. Leonard looked at her with a sneer of recognition. He knew Avery. He knew I had hired her, but he had no idea of the scope of power I had given her. He waved a hand dismissively. He told the doctors to ignore her. He called it overkill. He said that a father's rights superseded a piece of paper signed 3 years ago. He tried to steamroll her with his presence, his title, his arrogance, but Avery did not move. She informed him that under state law, she had the right to be present for all medical discussions and to advocate for the patient's previously stated wishes, and she reminded him that my stated wish was to live. The interrogation lasted for nearly 30 minutes. Leonard argued with Dr. Calder. He argued with Avery. He questioned the competence of the medical team. He suggested that perhaps I had suffered enough. He used words like mercy and dignity to mask his greed. He was looking for a way out. He was looking for a doctor who would agree that the surgery was futile, that the kindest thing to do was to let me go. He threatened to transfer me to another facility within the Blakeline network, a place where the administrators were his employees and the doctors knew who signed their paychecks. Dr. Calder stood her ground, but she was shaken. She needed consent to operate, and Leonard was stalling. He was running out the clock on my brain. Finally, Leonard turned his back on the doctor. He faced Graham Holt. They were standing less than 5 feet from my bed. They thought they were speaking in confidence. They thought the beep of the ventilator covered their words. They thought Avery was too far away to hear the specifics. But Avery's recorder was high fidelity. It caught the rustle of his suit jacket. It caught the intake of his breath. And it caught the sentence that would end him. Leonard looked at the monitor, watching my heart rate trace a green line across the screen. He looked at the daughter who had built his compliance department, the daughter who had loaned money to his son, the daughter who held the $15 million he needed to save his merger. He spoke clearly. There was no hesitation in his voice, only the cold, hard calculation of a businessman cutting a loss. He said to let her pass. He said that they would not pay for the surgery. He said that the trust reverts to him. He said it is the practical choice. The words hung in the air. Toxic and absolute. Let her pass. It was not a medical decision. It was an execution order. He was not choosing to spare me pain. He was choosing to liquidate an asset. He was effectively suffocating me with a balance sheet. Avery did not gasp. She did not scream. She simply ensured the red light on her recorder was steady. She knew that if she interrupted him now, if she played her hand too early, he might backtrack. He might claim it was grief speaking. She needed the refusal of care to be official. She needed him to sign the do not resuscitate order, and he did. He took the clipboard from the nurse. He drew a line through the surgical consent. He signed the DNR order with a flourish, the same signature he used on merger contracts and charity checks. He handed the clipboard back to Dr. Calder and told her to keep me comfortable. He told her that nature should take its course. Then he adjusted his tie, checked his watch, and turned to leave. He had a press conference to prepare for in the morning. He had to look like a grieving father. He had to explain to the world that despite the best efforts of his own hospital, his beloved daughter had succumbed to her injuries. He walked out of the ICU, leaving me to die, confident that the problem of Gemma Carter had been solved. He believed that the $15 million was as good as wired into his account. He did not know that behind him, in the sterile silence of the room, Avery Cole was already saving the file. He did not know that Dr. Calder was already picking up the phone to call a judge for an emergency injunction to override the DNR based on the power of attorney. And he certainly did not know that the daughter he had just condemned to death had heard him. The anger that had sparked in me during the crash had now hardened into something colder, something permanent. He had chosen the money. He had chosen the practical choice. So would I. The first thing I felt was the absence of the tube. For days, my world had been a narrow tunnel of darkness interrupted by the intrusive, choking sensation of plastic down my throat. Now, that intrusion was gone. My throat felt raw, as if I had swallowed broken glass, and my chest ached with a dull, bruising throb where the seatbelt had nearly snapped my ribs in two. But the air entering my lungs was cool and mine. It was not forced in by a bellows. I was breathing. I opened my eyes. The light was aggressive, a harsh fluorescent white that made my vision swim. I blinked, trying to clear the sticky film from my eyelashes. A face hovered above me. It was Dr. Renee Calder. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, but when she saw my eyes focus on hers, her expression crumbled into sheer, unadulterated relief. She looked like she was about to weep. She asked me to squeeze her hand. I squeezed it. I felt the bones of her fingers compress under mine. It was a weak grip, nothing like the strength I used to have in the gym or on the steering wheel, but the signal traveled from my brain to my nerves to my muscles without interruption. She asked me to wiggle my toes. I did. Then came the real test, the one Leonard was banking on me failing. She asked me my name. My voice was a rusty croak, barely a whisper. I said Gemma Carter. She asked me the year. I said 2024. She asked me who the president was. I answered correctly. She held up 3 fingers and asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. 93, 86, 79, 72. I stopped at 65, not because I could not continue, but because I saw the tension drain out of Dr. Calder's shoulders. She let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. She told me I was back. She told me I was intact. She did not know that while my brain was intact, my soul had been cauterized. An hour later, Avery Cole slipped into the room. She looked worse than the doctor. Her tailored suit was wrinkled, and her hair, usually pulled back in a severe professional bun, was fraying at the edges. She looked like a woman who had been holding up a collapsing ceiling with her bare hands. She closed the door and locked it. Then she pulled the blinds shut, casting the room into a gray twilight. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was feeling. She walked to the side of the bed, pulled a set of noise-canceling headphones from her bag, and placed them gently over my ears. She plugged the cord into her phone and pressed play. The sound quality was terrifyingly clear. It was the ambient hum of this very room, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors that had been the soundtrack to my coma. Then, my father's voice cut through the static. Let her pass. We will not pay for the surgery. The trust reverts to me. It is the practical choice. I listened to the entire recording. I listened to him bargain with my life. I listened to him dismiss 70% odds as a bad investment. I listened to the scratching sound of his pen signing the "Do Not Resuscitate" order. When the recording ended, silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Avery took the headphones off. She was watching me closely, waiting for the breakdown. She was waiting for the daughter to mourn the father. She was waiting for the tears of betrayal, the denial, the screaming match with the universe, but I did not cry. I lay there, staring at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, crystalline clarity. The part of me that was Leonard Blake's daughter, the part that had sought his approval, the part that had stayed in the company to protect his legacy, the part that had hoped he was just misguided and not evil, had died on that highway. Leonard had signed a death certificate for me, but he had only succeeded in killing his own child. The woman in the hospital bed was someone else entirely. I looked at Avery. My voice was still raspy, but the tremor was gone. I told her that we were not going to confront him in a corridor. I told her we were not going to sue him in a quiet settlement meeting where he could pay us off with insurance money. I told her we were going to bury him in a ballroom. Avery nodded slowly. A grim smile touched her lips. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a file. She told me that while I was asleep, she had been busy. She had sent my anonymized medical records to 3 independent neurospecialists at top research hospitals across the country, places outside of the Blake Line network. She showed me the emails. Every single one of them concurred. The decision to sign a DNR, given my vitals and the specific nature of the hematoma, was medically negligent at best and criminally malicious at worst. They all agreed that the 70% figure was conservative. One specialist called the DNR unconscionable. We had the weapon. Now we needed the battlefield. Dr. Calder, who had been standing by the window, turned to face us. She looked nervous. She was a brilliant surgeon, but she was not a politician, and she was terrified of Leonard. She warned me that Leonard had been busy too. She told me that for the last 3 days, he had been weaving a narrative throughout the hospital and the business community. He was telling board members, investors, and anyone who would listen that the accident had left me severely compromised. He was using phrases like profound cognitive deficit and permanent executive dysfunction. He was painting a picture of a woman who drooled, who could not remember her own name, and who certainly could not manage a $15 million trust fund. She told me he was preparing to file for emergency guardianship to protect my assets. I understood the play immediately. If I appeared healthy, if I walked out of here speaking in full sentences and citing case law, he would lose access to the money. But worse, if I confronted him now, privately, he would destroy the evidence. He would claim the recording was doctored. He would fire Dr. Calder. He would bury the truth under a mountain of litigation that would last for years. By the time we won, the merger would be closed, the money would be laundered, and he would be untouchable. I needed him to feel safe. I needed him to walk into that merger ceremony believing he had won. I needed him to stand on that stage, arrogant and unopposed, so that when I pulled the rug out, he would have nowhere to fall but into the abyss. I made a decision that went against every instinct of my pride. I looked at Dr. Calder and told her that Leonard was right. She looked confused. I told her that from this moment on, Gemma Carter, the sharp-witted director of compliance, was gone. In her place was the tragedy Leonard wanted. I told her I was going to play the part. I explained the strategy. I would feign memory loss. I would mix up my words. I would stare blankly at walls. I would ask for my mother, who had been dead for 12 years. I would give Leonard exactly what he needed to feel secure enough to proceed with his theft. Dr. Calder hesitated. She said that falsifying medical records was a crime. I told her not to falsify them. I told her to document my physical recovery accurately, my motor skills, my healing ribs. But for the cognitive notes, I asked her to be vague. I asked her to write phrases like patient exhibits, confusion, or possible short-term memory impairment. I asked her to keep the detailed results of the cognitive test I had just aced in her private, personal notes, not in the digital system that Leonard's administrators could access. I told her to hide the truth in her pocket until I called her to the stand. She looked at Avery, then back at me. She took a deep breath and nodded. She said she would write that my orientation was fluctuating. It was technically true, she reasoned, since I was planning to fluctuate between genius and vegetable depending on who walked into the room. Avery then pulled out her phone. She said we needed a way to communicate that Leonard's IT team could not monitor. If I was going to be playing the role of a confused invalid, I could not be seen texting my lawyer about corporate law. She installed an app on my personal phone. The icon looked like a stylized lotus flower. It was labeled Mindful Breath. To anyone checking my phone, it looked like a meditation timer for a recovering trauma patient. She showed me how it worked. You opened the app, and a soothing blue circle pulsed on the screen. But if you held your thumb on the center of the lotus for 3 seconds and entered a biometric code, it opened an encrypted chat interface. It was a ghost channel. Avery told me she would upload everything there: the recording, the financial documents proving the shell companies, the draft of the board bylaws. I could review the evidence at night, in the dark, while the nurses thought I was sleeping. The plan was set. The timeline was tight. The shareholder meeting and the merger signing ceremony at the Regency Crown Hotel were in 8 days. 8 days of acting. 8 days of letting my father look at me with fake pity while he plotted to liquidate my future. Avery packed up her things. She squeezed my hand. Harder this time. She told me to rest. She told me to be careful. She said that playing dead was dangerous because sometimes people forgot you were still alive. When they left, I was alone in the room again. The silence was no longer heavy. It was pregnant with anticipation. I lay back against the pillows and stared up at the ceiling tiles. I counted them. 14 across, 12 down, 168 tiles. I tested myself. I recited the first 10 amendments of the Constitution in my head. I calculated the compound interest on $15 million over 10 years at a 5% annual return. I recalled the license plate number of the truck that hit me. My mind was a razor. It was the only weapon I had left, and I had to keep it sheathed until the perfect moment. I whispered into the empty room, a prayer not to God, but to my own synapses. Stay sharp for 8 days, I whispered. Just give me 8 days, long enough to end him. Then, I heard the heavy footsteps of my father approaching the door. I let my facial muscles go slack. I unfocused my eyes. I let my mouth hang open slightly. I erased the intelligence from my gaze. The door opened. Leonard walked in. He looked at me, and for the first time, he smiled a genuine smile. He saw a broken thing. He saw a payday. I looked through him, vacantly, and asked him if it was raining. He patted my hand the first time he had touched me in years and told me not to worry about the rain. He said he would take care of everything. I let him believe it. The legal machinery designed to strip me of my life did not look like a weapon. It looked like a stack of cream-colored bond paper, stapled at the top left corner, sitting on the tray table of my hospital bed. It was a petition for emergency guardianship filed with the Oak Ridge County Court. In the sterile language of the law, my father was asking the state to declare me an incapacitated person. He was asking to be named the conservator of my estate. The petition described me as a tragedy. It called me a woman whose executive-level intellect was permanently compromised. It claimed that I was unable to distinguish a contract from a grocery list. It was a masterclass in fiction, but the threat it posed was terrifyingly real. Avery had uploaded the scans to our encrypted channel just 20 minutes ago. I lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through the statutes of Illinois probate law. Leonard was moving faster than we had anticipated. He was not waiting for a monthly hearing. He was filing ex parte an emergency motion that allows a judge to make a ruling without the other party present, usually reserved for situations where there is immediate danger of harm or financial loss. The irony was suffocating. The only immediate danger of financial loss was coming from the man filing the petition. The cornerstone of his application was a psychiatric evaluation conducted the previous afternoon. The evaluator was Dr. Marcus Aris, a psychiatrist who I knew played golf with Leonard at the Skyline Club. The evaluation had been a farce. Dr. Aris had breezed into my ICU room smelling of mints and stale tobacco. He had spent exactly 12 minutes with me. He did not administer the standard battery of cognitive tests. He did not ask me to solve logic puzzles or recall complex sequences. Instead, he had asked me how I was feeling, checked his watch 3 times, and then asked me if I knew the value of a quarter versus a dime. I had played my part perfectly. I had looked at the coins in his hand, furrowed my brow, and told him that the silver one was pretty because it was shiny. He had smirked, patted my shoulder, and left, now, reading the 8-page report he had generated from that 12-minute interaction. I marveled at his creative writing skills. He wrote that I demonstrated profound confusion regarding basic financial concepts. He claimed I exhibited emotional volatility consistent with frontal lobe damage. He concluded that I was unable to manage complex assets, specifically the $15 million trust fund currently in her name. It was a rubber stamp, a paid-for diagnosis designed to hand my father the keys to the vault. But the most damning document was not the psychiatric report. It was the attachment Avery had found buried deep in the filing exhibits. It was a pre-drafted transfer authorization. Usually, when a guardian takes over an estate, the assets are frozen or moved into a protected custodial account monitored by the court. But Leonard had prepared a different order. He was asking for permission to consolidate my assets for administrative efficiency. The destination account was listed as the Blake Line Emergency Operations Fund. I knew that account. During my time as Director of Compliance, I had flagged that fund twice. It was a black hole. It was the account Leonard used to pay off settlements that had non-disclosure agreements attached to them. It was where money went to die. Or more accurately, where it went to wash away his mistakes. If the judge signed this order, my $15 million would flow from my trust, through the guardianship, and straight into the corporate abyss of Blake Line within 24 hours. Once it was commingled with company funds, it would be gone spent on the Triaxis merger, used to plug the holes in the charity audits, or simply vanished into offshore accounts. I tapped the screen of my phone, sending a message to Avery on the Mindful Breath app. He is trying to bypass the mandatory 30-day holding period. Who is the judge? Avery's reply came a moment later. Judge Silas Thorne. I closed my eyes. Of course. Silas Thorne. He was another fixture at the country club. He and Leonard had been photographed together at 3 different charity galas in the last 2 years. Thorne was known for rubber-stamping guardianship requests for the wealthy families of Riverton, keeping their dirty laundry out of the public docket. We had to stop this, but we could not simply walk into court and contest it, because that would reveal I was competent, which would tip Leonard off before the merger ceremony. Avery had a plan. She was currently drafting a writ of prohibition to be sent to the Midwest Appellate Court. It was a high-risk legal maneuver. She was not arguing that I was sane, not yet. She was arguing that Judge Thorne had a gross conflict of interest due to his personal relationship with the petitioner. She was including the digital receipts of the golf outings and the charity dinners, and as a nuclear option, she was attaching a sealed copy of the ICU recording. Her argument to the appellate court was simple. The lower court cannot impartially rule on a guardianship when the petitioner is on tape discussing the patient's death as a financial strategy. We were asking the higher court to stay the proceedings, to freeze everything pending a review. It would buy us time. It would keep the money in my trust for at least another week. That was all I needed. But there was another signature on the guardianship petition that hurt worse than the lies of Dr. Aris or the corruption of Judge Thorne. It was on the affidavit of support. Ethan Blake. My brother. The boy I had protected from Leonard's temper when we were children. The man I had bailed out of a $1.5 million debt just 6 months ago. He had signed a sworn statement attesting that he had visited me, that I was incoherent, and that he believed it was in my best interest for our father to control my finances. I zoomed in on the signature. The ink was shaky. The loop of the E was jagged, not smooth. He had been drinking when he signed this, or he had been terrified. He was convincing himself that he was doing me a favor. I could hear his internal monologue as clearly as if he were standing in the room. She won't know. He would be telling himself, she is brain damaged. She doesn't need the money anymore. Dad will take care of her. He was selling me out to save himself. Leonard must have promised to forgive Ethan's debts, or perhaps threatened to expose his embezzlement. In exchange for this signature, Ethan was weak, and Leonard feasted on weakness. I felt a cold knot of disappointment tighten in my stomach. I had expected Leonard to be a monster. I had hoped Ethan would be a man. I was wrong. The next morning, the theater continued. Leonard brought in another specialist, a neurologist this time, to bolster his case. This doctor, a woman named Dr. Lynn, was not on Leonard's payroll. She was a serious, ethical clinician from the university hospital who had been brought in for a second opinion to make the file look robust. This was the danger zone. If I played too dumb, she would confirm the diagnosis of incompetence. If I seemed too smart, she would report that I was recovering, and Leonard would be alerted. I had to thread a needle in the dark. Dr. Lynn asked me to subtract 7 from 100. I looked at her, blinked slowly, and said, 93. Then I paused, looked confused, and added, "Is that the year my mom died?" It was the perfect mix of cognitive ability and disorientation. I showed I could do the math, but that my context was scrambled. She asked me if I knew where I was. I told her I was at work. I told her I needed to finish the compliance report for the Archer Medical Group. Dr. Lin frowned and wrote something in her notebook. I knew what she was thinking. Archer Medical Group. It was a specific detail. A complex memory. A patient with global brain damage usually does not recall specific vendor names. I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't buying the vegetable narrative entirely. She suspected that beneath the trauma, the engine was still running, but she couldn't prove it yet. "Do you trust your father, Gemma?" she asked suddenly. It was a question that wasn't on the standard test. I looked at the door to make sure it was closed. I looked at her name tag. Then I lowered my voice, dropping the confused act for exactly 3 seconds. "My father likes money more than people," I whispered. Then I leaned back, let my jaw go slack, and asked her if she had brought me any ice cream. Dr. Lin stared at me for a long moment. She closed her notebook. She didn't write down the ice cream comment. Instead, she wrote, "Patient exhibits flashes of high-level insight amidst confusion. Further observation recommended." She was an ally I hadn't expected. She wouldn't give Leonard the slam-dunk diagnosis he wanted. Her report would be ambiguous. It would be a speed bump in his race to the bank. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the ICU was shifting. The nurses, the women and men who actually cared for me, were becoming restless. They spent 12 hours a shift with me. They saw me when Leonard wasn't there. They saw the clarity in my eyes when I asked for water. They heard me say thank you and please with appropriate intonation. They knew I wasn't a vegetable, but the hospital administration, under pressure from Leonard, had circulated a memo. It instructed staff to manage expectations regarding my recovery and to defer all questions about my cognitive state to the family spokesperson. It was a gag order. My primary nurse, a woman named Sarah, who had been with me since the first night, came in to change my IV. She looked angry. She slammed the saline bag onto the hook a little too hard. "They want me to tell the consultant that you're unresponsive," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "I'm not a liar." I reached out and touched her wrist. I put a finger to my lips. Later that afternoon, Avery arrived during visiting hours. She wasn't carrying her briefcase. She was carrying a box of donuts for the nursing station. She cornered Sarah and 2 other nurses in the break room. She didn't ask them to break HIPAA. She asked them to protect their licenses. "If Dr. Mahesh Blake is misrepresenting the patient's condition in legal filings," Avery told them, "and you are on record supporting those lies, you could be liable for aiding and fraud. I need you to protect yourselves." She pulled out 3 affidavits. They were simple statements of fact. On this date, at this time, the patient was alert, oriented, and conversed in full sentences. It took 20 minutes of hushed conversation, but Sarah and 2 others signed. Avery notarized them on the spot. We now had 3 sworn statements from medical professionals that directly contradicted the 8-page lie Dr. Aris had written. These affidavits were the landmines we would detonate if the appellate court maneuver failed. But the final piece of the puzzle fell into place that night, and it didn't come from Avery. It came from my own fingertips. At 2 a.m, the ICU was quiet. I pulled my laptop out from under my mattress, where Sarah had agreed to hide it for me. I connected to the hospital Wi-Fi using a VPN. I still had my corporate login credentials. Leonard had stripped me of my physical keys, but in his arrogance, he hadn't wiped my digital access yet. He probably thought a brain-damaged woman couldn't type a password. I logged into the Blakeline executive server. I didn't go for the financial records. We already had those. I went for the email logs. I searched for my own name. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 days ago, Leonard had sent an email to the due diligence team at Triaxis, the company he was merging with. The subject line was Risk Mitigation, G. Carter. Attached to the email were my full medical files, my unredacted brain scans, the notes from the ICU, the psychiatric evaluation. He had sent my private, protected health information to a third-party corporation to prove to them that I was not a liability to the merger. He was using my trauma as a marketing tool. This was a violation of federal HIPAA laws so flagrant it carried criminal penalties. It was a breach of privacy that would strip him of his medical license. But more importantly, it was a breach of the corporate bylaws. I found the specific clause in the Blake Line governance documents. Any executive officer found to have willfully disclosed confidential patient data for personal or commercial gain is subject to immediate termination for cause. He had handed me the gun. I downloaded the email chain. I forwarded it to Avery's secure server. Then I lay back in the dark, the glow of the laptop screen fading from my retinas. Leonard thought he was building a cage for me with his guardianship papers and his fake doctors. He didn't realize he was building his own prison cell. He wanted to prove I was incompetent. I had just proven he was a criminal. I closed my eyes and visualized the calendar. 5 days left until the merger ceremony. 5 days until I stood up in the Regency Crown Ballroom and showed the world exactly what kind of father Leonard Blake really was. He was coming for my $15 million. I was coming for everything he had. My hospital room had transformed into a command center, though to the nurses and orderlies, it still looked like a place of rest. The curtains were drawn against the mid-morning sun, casting long gray shadows across the bed where I lay, ostensibly recovering from a traumatic brain injury. But inside my mind, and inside the encrypted hard drives Avery Cole had smuggled in, a massive, complex machine was being assembled. We were no longer just looking for a way to stop the guardianship. We were building a gallows. Avery sat in the corner chair, her laptop balanced on her knees, the blue light of the screen illuminating her tired face. She had been awake for 30 hours, fueled by bad hospital coffee and the thrill of the hunt. She was not just my lawyer anymore, she was the architect of my father's destruction. She had systematized every scrap of evidence we had collected over the last 3 years. It was a terrifying mosaic of corruption. On one screen, she had the timeline of my accident and the subsequent medical decisions. The audio file of Leonard ordering the doctors to let me pass was the centerpiece, the emotional anchor of our case, but around it, she had woven a web of cold, hard documentation that proved his cruelty was not an impulsive act of grief, but a calculated business maneuver. We had the medical records from the independent specialists, confirming that the do not resuscitate order was medically baseless. We had the affidavits from the nurses, swearing that I was alert and oriented while Leonard told the world I was a vegetable. And we had the emails. Those leaked emails were the smoking gun that connected the hospital room to the boardroom. I watched as Avery pulled up a chain of correspondence between Leonard and the lead investors of Triaxis. The timestamps were damning, less than 12 hours after he signed the order to let me die. Leonard had emailed the bankers to assure them that the instability regarding the Pierce Trust had been resolved and that the liquidity required for the merger would be available within the week. He had sold my death as a closing condition for the deal, but the rot went deeper than just my trust fund. We had finally cracked the code of the Blake Hope Foundation. For months, I had suspected that the charity was a sham, but I had never been able to see where the money went after it left our accounts. I knew it went to shell companies like Nexus Biologistics, but the trail usually went cold there. Avery, however, had brought in a forensic accountant, a man who used to hunt assets for the divorce lawyers of Chicago's billionaires. He had found the loop. The Blake Hope Foundation donated tens of millions of dollars to these vague research entities for medical advancement. Those entities, which had no labs and no scientists, then paid consulting fees and licensing royalties to holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Zurich. Those offshore holding companies were subsidiaries of a parent corporation called Gemini Vantage, and Gemini Vantage was 80% owned by Blake Line Health Alliance. It was a washing machine. Leonard was taking tax-exempt charitable donations, spinning them through a cycle of fake vendors, and funneling the clean cash back into his own company's offshore reserves to artificially inflate the balance sheet. He was using charity money to prop up the stock price. It was not just unethical, it was federal wire fraud. It was tax evasion. It was money laundering on an industrial scale. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling tiles, tracing the pattern of the cracks. I realized that my father was not just a greedy man, he was a desperate one. The entire empire he had built, the shiny towers and the state-of-the-art clinics, was built on a foundation of hollow debt and stolen money. The Triaxis merger was not an expansion. It was a frantic attempt to become too big to fail before the house of cards collapsed. But we needed a way to execute him quickly. A lawsuit would take years. A federal investigation would take months. The merger was happening in 4 days. I closed my eyes and walked through the corridors of my memory, back to the days when I drafted compliance policies for the company. I remembered the bylaws. I remembered the corporate governance document that Leonard had revised 5 years ago when he wanted to oust a medical director who refused to cut costs on anesthesia. I opened my eyes and reached for my phone. I opened the Mindful Breath app and typed a message to Avery. Check Article 4, Section 9 of the corporate bylaws. The removal clause. Avery tapped furiously on her keyboard. A moment later, she stopped. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. She read it aloud. Any executive officer found to have committed gross medical ethics violations that endanger the reputation or licensure of the institution may be removed by a 2/3 vote of the board of directors, effective within 24 hours of the determination. Leonard had written that clause to use as a weapon against doctors who had a conscience. He had defined gross medical ethics violations broadly so he could fire anyone who stood in his way. He never imagined that the violation would be his own. He never imagined that signing a DNR for his daughter to steal her inheritance would fall squarely under the definition of endangering the institution's reputation. We had the mechanism. Now we needed the votes. The Blake Line board had 9 members. We needed 2/3. We needed 6 votes. Leonard controlled 3 members securely, his cronies from the country club, who were as dirty as he was. That left 6. We needed a clean sweep of the remaining members. We pulled up the bios of the board members. We analyzed them like we were selecting jurors for a capital murder trial. First, there was Dr. Alma Rios. She was the chief of pediatrics. She had been a resident under my mother. Elena, 30 years ago, she worshipped the ground my mother walked on. She had always looked at Leonard with suspicion, but she stayed on the board to protect the children's hospital. If she knew Leonard was trying to steal Elena's money by killing Elena's daughter, she would not just vote to fire him, she would want to strangle him. Second, there was Victor Hale. He was the representative for the institutional investors, the pension funds, and the retirement accounts. Victor did not care about feelings. He did not care about families. He cared about risk. He was terrified of the Securities and Exchange Commission. If we proved to him that Leonard was a walking regulatory nuclear bomb, Victor would cut the cord to save the share price. Third, there was Janice Rowe. She was a professor of bioethics and a former judge. She was the moral compass of the board, often outvoted but never silenced. To her, the sanctity of the patient-advocate relationship was holy writ. Leonard's violation of my medical proxy would be blasphemy to her. We had our 3 key targets. If we could turn them, they would bring the other 3 independent members with them. Avery spent the next 6 hours compiling 3 identical digital packets. They were encrypted, password-protected, and designed to self-delete after one viewing. The packet contained the ICU recording. It contained the side-by-side comparison of the fake psychiatric report and the real nursing affidavits. It contained the flowchart of the money laundering scheme. And it contained a simple, chilling cover letter. For your eyes only, a life-and-death ethical breach by the current CEO involves immediate criminal liability and will be disclosed publicly at the Triaxis merger event. You have one chance to be on the right side of history. We did not send them yet. We timed the delivery for the morning of the ceremony. We wanted them to be reading the evidence while they were putting on their tuxedos and evening gowns. We wanted the horror to be fresh when they walked into the ballroom, but the war was expanding beyond the boardroom. Avery's phone buzzed. It was a message from her contact in Washington. The Securities and Exchange Commission had noticed something. Their algorithms had flagged a series of unusual stock trades involving Blake Line shares. Large blocks of stock were being sold by entities linked to the research partners of the Blake Hope Foundation just days before the merger announcement. It was insider trading. Leonard was not just stealing from the charity. He was tipping off his co-conspirators to cash out before the market shifted. Avery looked at me, her face grim. She told me that a special agent from the Financial Crimes Division had opened a preliminary inquiry, but federal agents are cautious. They move slow. They need a smoking gun to turn a civil inquiry into a criminal raid. They needed a confession, or the next best thing. They needed a recording of the CEO admitting that the funds were fungible. We had that. We had Leonard on tape telling his lawyer that the trust fund would be more useful in the foundation than in his daughter. It was the bridge that connected the personal malice to the financial crime. Avery told me that if we played this right, if we released the evidence at the exact moment of maximum visibility, we could trigger a federal raid. I lay in the silence of the room, feeling the weight of what we were about to do. This was no longer a surgical strike. It was a carpet bombing. I thought about Ethan. My brother's name was on the guardianship papers. His signature was on the lies. He was the CFO of the company. He had signed off on the financial statements that hid the money laundering, even if he did it under duress, even if he did it because he was weak and terrified of our father. He was legally complicit. If I pulled this trigger, Leonard would go to prison, but Ethan would go down with him. He would lose his license, his reputation, and likely his freedom. I remembered the little boy who used to hide behind my legs when our parents argued. I remembered the man who looked at me with pleading eyes in the rain-slicked parking lot. He had a choice. He could have come to me. He could have told me about the plot. He could have refused to sign the affidavit that declared me incompetent. Instead, he had chosen the path of least resistance. He had chosen to let his sister be erased so he could keep his comfortable life. I closed my eyes and felt a tear finally leak out, not for myself, and not for my father, but for the brother I had already lost. I looked at Avery. My voice was steady, cold as the winter rain outside. I told her to include Ethan in the dossier. I told her not to redact his name. Avery nodded. She understood. There is no such thing as a partial purge. If you cut out the cancer, you have to take the margins too. The plan solidified in the air between us. We would not go to the judge. We would not go to the police station. Those venues were too quiet, too controllable. Leonard could buy a judge. He could delay a detective, but he could not buy live television. He could not delay a room full of 200 shareholders and the entire business press corps. The Regency Crown Hotel ballroom, the stage where he planned to announce his coronation as the king of Midwestern healthcare, that was where we would execute him. We would let him climb the steps. We would let him take the microphone. We would let him believe, right up until the last second, that he had gotten away with it, and then we would play the tape. I whispered to the empty air of the room. I said that he wanted a show. I said that on Tuesday night, I would give him one. The hearing that stripped me of my legal personhood took less time than it takes to eat a sandwich. It happened in a small, wood-paneled courtroom in Oak Ridge County, a room that smelled of floor wax and old decisions. I was not there. Of course, I was lying in my hospital bed, staring at a live text feed from Avery, but I could see the scene as clearly as if I were sitting in the gallery. Leonard played the role of his life. He stood before Judge Silas Thorne, a man he had played golf with at the Skyline Club every Sunday for the past 10 years. Leonard wore his darkest suit, his shoulders slumped in a perfectly calibrated display of paternal grief. He told the court that his daughter, once a brilliant executive, had been reduced to a tragic shell. He used phrases like executive-level intellect permanently compromised. He told the judge that I could no longer distinguish a $20 bill from a credit card. He presented the hastily written, 8-page psychiatric report from Dr. Aris as if it were the gospel truth. Judge Thorne did not ask for a second opinion. He did not ask why the patient was not present. He did not ask why the petition was filed on an emergency basis when the patient was stable. He simply nodded. He murmured his condolences. He treated the law not as a shield for the vulnerable, but as a rubber stamp for the powerful. In 20 minutes, it was done. The gavel came down. Leonard was granted temporary emergency guardianship over my person and my estate. In the eyes of the state of Illinois, Gemma Carter no longer existed as a competent adult. I was a ward. I was property. Avery Cole, standing in the back of the room, offered only a token objection. She did not scream. She did not produce the recording. She simply noted her objection for the record and sat down. This was the hardest part of our strategy. We had to lose the battle to win the war. We had to let Leonard believe that the legal system had worked exactly the way he paid for it to work. We needed his arrogance to swell until it blinded him. As soon as the hearing adjourned, Avery filed a notice of appeal with the clerk. It was a quiet piece of paper, buried in the stack, but it was the fuse for the bomb we would detonate tomorrow. She then immediately transmitted the file to the appellate court, along with the sealed evidence of the conflict of interest. But Leonard did not know that. Leonard only knew he had won. He did not waste a single second. At 4 p.m, while I was supposedly napping, my phone buzzed with a notification from the banking app I was not supposed to be able to use. It was an alert. A transfer had been initiated. $15 million. The destination was the Blakeline Emergency Operations Fund. The effective date was tomorrow. Scheduled for 9 a.m. He was cutting it close. The signing ceremony for the Triaxis merger was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. He needed that money to hit the corporate account 1 hour before he walked onto the stage. He needed the balance sheet to look solvent for exactly 60 minutes so he could sign the deal and bury his debt. I looked at the screen. $15 million. My mother's life work. He was stealing it with a few keystrokes, authorized by a judge who cared more about his golf handicap than justice. I knew what I had to do next. I had to make the call. I needed to cement his confidence. I needed him to believe that I was not only defeated but completely unaware of my defeat. I picked up the landline next to my bed, the monitored line, the one he would expect me to use. I dialed his cell number. He answered on the second ring. His voice was brisk, businesslike. He was likely already celebrating. Hello? I pitched my voice up an octave. I slowed my cadence. I injected a tremor of confusion and childish longing into my tone. Daddy? I asked. Is that you? There was a pause on the line. I could hear the clink of glass in the background. He was drinking. Gemma, he said, his voice shifting instantly to the fake, soothing tone he used for the doctors. How are you feeling, sweetheart? I feel fuzzy, I said. The doctor said I can go home tomorrow, but I don't want to go home. It's too quiet. We will get you the best nurses, he promised. You will be taken care of. Daddy, I said, letting a whine creep into my voice. I heard the nurses talking. They said there is a big party tomorrow, at the hotel, with lights and cameras. Leonard went silent. I held my breath. I was dangling the bait. I want to see the lights, I said. Can I come? Please, I just want to sit and watch you talk. You talk so good. Daddy, I want to see the pretty lights. I waited. I knew exactly what was going through his mind. He was calculating the optics. A brain-damaged daughter, sitting in the front row, watching her father's triumph. It would be the ultimate prop. It would humanize him. It would make him look like a saint who cared for his invalid child while saving the healthcare industry. It would explain away my absence from the business side of the deal. She is here, the image would say, but she is broken. So look at me instead. Of course, Gemma, he said finally. The greed in his voice was so thick, I could almost taste it through the receiver. I think that is a wonderful idea. You should be there with me. I will send a car for you in the morning. Thank you. Daddy, I whispered. I love you. I hung up the phone. I felt physically ill. The I love you tasted like bile in my throat. But the trap was set. He wasn't just letting me into the building. He was giving me a front row seat. While I was playing the dutiful, broken daughter, Avery was waging a silent war with the banking system. She was not in the hospital. She was in her office, on a secure video conference with the fraud department of the custodial bank that held my trust. This bank was in Delaware, far outside Judge Thorne's jurisdiction. Avery presented them with a terrifying package. She showed them the guardianship order, but she also showed them the sworn affidavits from the nurses stating I was competent. She played them the recording of Leonard saying the trust would be more useful to him if I was dead, and she presented a draft of the emergency stay we were filing with the appellate court. She told the bank officer that if they processed the transfer of $15 million at 9 in the morning, based on a fraudulent guardianship order, they would be knowingly participating in a felony wire fraud scheme. She used words like aiding and abetting and federal RICO charges. The bank officer, a man who likely just wanted to go home to his family, turned pale. He did exactly what Avery wanted. He flagged the account. He placed a compliance hold on the transaction pending judicial review. The money would not move at 9. The transfer would hang in limbo. Leonard would not get the notification until the transaction failed, which would likely be minutes before he took the stage. By the time he realized the money wasn't there, he would already be in the spotlight. Back in the hospital room, the sun had set. The room was dark. I was packing my small bag. I had been cleared for discharge in the morning, ostensibly to go into home care, but in reality, to go to war. A nurse knocked softly and entered. It was Sarah, the one who had hidden my laptop. She looked over her shoulder to make sure the hallway was empty, then handed me a sealed manila envelope. She didn't say a word. She just pressed it into my hand and squeezed my fingers. I opened it. Inside was a copy of my true medical chart, not the sanitized version Leonard had seen, but the raw notes from the residents and the attending physicians who had actually treated me. Patient alert, patient oriented to person, place, and time, patient asking detailed questions about pharmacology, patient displays no signs of cognitive deficit, and tucked into the pocket of the navy blue suit my mother had bought me, the suit I had asked Sarah to retrieve from my apartment, was the most important piece of paper of all. It was a copy of the toxicology report from the crash, proving I was sober. I ran my hand over the fabric of the suit. It was a power suit, sharp and tailored. My mother had given it to me the day I became director of compliance. She had told me, "Gemma, in a room full of men who think they own the world, wear this and remind them that they only rent it." I hung the suit on the IV stand. It looked like a soldier's uniform waiting for the morning. I knew where Leonard was right now. I didn't need a tracker to know. It was the night before the biggest deal of his life. He would be at the Skyline Club, on the top floor of the Blakeline Tower. I could imagine the scene perfectly. He would be sitting in his favorite leather booth, the one with the view of the city he thought he ruled. He would be drinking a 30-year-old scotch. Ethan would be with him. Ethan, my brother. I imagined Ethan sitting there, nursing a drink he didn't want, his leg bouncing under the table. Leonard would be expansive, boasting, manic with victory. "Tomorrow," Leonard would be saying, gesturing with his glass. "Tomorrow, everything goes back to the way it should be. The merger closes, the debt is wiped, and Gemma, well, Gemma won't have to worry about money ever again. Daddy will handle it. Daddy will handle it." The phrase sent a shiver down my spine. I wondered if Ethan understood what that really meant. I wondered if he realized that handling it meant erasing his sister's existence. I wondered if, deep down in his whiskey-soaked conscience, Ethan knew he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He probably laughed nervously. He probably agreed. He probably told himself that this was the only way out. He didn't know that I had already instructed Avery to put his name on the list of co-conspirators. He didn't know that his signature on the guardianship papers had sealed his fate alongside our father's. I walked to the window of my hospital room. It was raining again. The city lights smeared against the glass, turning Riverton into a watercolor painting of gold and black. I looked at the reflection of my face in the glass. I didn't see the bruising anymore. I didn't see the victim. I saw the prosecutor. I saw the judge. I saw the executioner. Leonard thought he was writing the story. He thought I was a character he could write out of the script with a pen stroke and a corrupt judge. He thought the $15 million was just a number on a ledger that he could move from column A to column B. He forgot that numbers are not just math, they are leverage. I touched the cold glass. "Enjoy your drink, Dad," I whispered to the city. "Enjoy the view." I turned back to the suit hanging in the darkness. "Tomorrow," I said to the empty room. "He will either take my life on paper, or I will take his empire in public." I climbed back into the bed, but I did not sleep. I lay there, listening to the rain, counting down the hours until 9 in the morning. The timer was running. The trap was primed. All I had to do was walk onto the stage and smile. The grand ballroom of the Regency Crown Hotel was not just a room. It was a statement. It was a cavernous space of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and velvet drapery, designed to make wealthy people feel secure in their wealth. The air conditioning was set to a crisp 68 degrees, but the heat from the television lights made the air feel thick and electric. 200 people filled the room. They were the titans of Midwestern industry, the institutional investors from Chicago and New York, and the hungry press corps looking for a headline. At the front of the room, dominating the stage, was a massive LED screen. It displayed the logo of Blakeline Health Alliance interlocking with the logo of the Triaxis Care Network. It looked like a marriage. It looked like destiny. I sat in the front row, slightly to the left of the center aisle. I was the prop. I was dressed in the navy blue suit my mother had given me, but I had allowed the makeup artist hired by Leonard to make me look pale. I sat with my shoulders hunched, my hands resting limply in my lap. I kept my head bowed, staring at the expensive carpet, letting my hair fall forward to obscure my face. I could feel the eyes on me. They were heavy. Sticky gazes filled with pity and morbid curiosity. I could hear the whispers. "That is the daughter. Tragic accident. Brain damage. She does not even know where she is." To them. I was a cautionary tale. I was the broken bird that made Leonard Blake's success story seem more poignant. I was the human cost that proved he was a survivor. Leonard stood at the podium. He looked magnificent. He was wearing a bespoke Italian suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his face tanned and radiating confidence. He was in his element. He gripped the sides of the lectern like a captain steering a ship through a storm, projecting his voice to the back of the room without needing the microphone. Though he used it for the cameras, he was talking about the future. He spoke of a revolution in patient care. He used buzzwords like synergy, integrated wellness, and holistic outcomes. He painted a picture of a healthcare system that cared more about healing than billing. A lie so audacious I almost laughed out loud. Then he pivoted to the charity. He gestured to the screen, which changed to show a montage of smiling children and doctors in lab coats, stock footage, all of it. He said that the Blake Hope Foundation had contributed $35 million to the community in the last 5 years. He said that they were funding groundbreaking research that would cure the incurable. I knew those numbers. I knew that $35 million had not gone to the community. It had gone to Delaware shell companies and Cayman Island accounts. It had gone to pay off his gambling debts and artificially inflate the company's quarterly earnings. It was blood money, laundered through the guise of philanthropy. Leonard paused. He looked down at me. The lighting director, following the script, dimmed the house lights and brought a soft, warm spotlight onto me. It was time for the emotional climax. Leonard's voice dropped to a hush. It was a masterclass in performance. He looked at me with misty eyes. He said that success means nothing without family. He said that my accident had reminded him of how fragile life truly is. He said that seeing me fight my way back from the brink of death had inspired him to push this merger through, to ensure that every family had access to the best care possible. He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. He said that I was his inspiration. The room was silent. You could hear a pin drop. The camera zoomed in on my face. The red tally lights were glowing. We were live on the local news and streaming to thousands of investors online. He thought this was his victory lap. He thought I was too confused to understand the words, too broken to react. I took a deep breath. I filled my lungs with the cold, conditioned air of the ballroom. Then, I lifted my head. I did not look confused. I did not look vacant. I looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera. And then I looked up at my father. I stood up. The movement was sharp, controlled, and powerful. I did not wobble. I stood at my full height, smoothing the jacket of my suit. A ripple of confusion went through the room. The script said I was supposed to wave weakly, or perhaps smile vacantly. I was not supposed to stand with the posture of a prosecutor. Leonard faltered. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly. I did not wait for him to recover. I projected my voice, using the diaphragm control I had learned in law school moot court. I did not need a microphone to be heard in the silence he had created. "Thank you, Dad," I said. My voice rang out, clear as a bell, cutting through the tension like a diamond through glass. Leonard froze. The smile on his face began to curdle into panic. "I do have something to add," I continued, stepping out into the aisle. "About how fragile life is when your own father signs a do not resuscitate order to steal your inheritance." The silence in the room shattered. It was not a roar of noise. It was a collective gasp, a vacuum of shock that sucked the air out of the ballroom. 200 heads turned simultaneously. The reporters, sensing blood, jumped to their feet, their phones raised high. The camera operators, trained to follow the action, swung their heavy lenses away from the podium and focused entirely on me. Leonard gripped the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cracking. He called for security. He laughed nervously, a high-pitched, terrified sound. He told the crowd that I was still confused. He said I was having an episode. He said I did not know what I was saying. He was gaslighting me in real time, on live television. But I was already moving. I walked toward the stage. I did not run. I walked with the steady, relentless pace of a woman who knows the law is on her side. "I am not confused, Leonard," I said, dropping the dad entirely. "And I am not having an episode." I reached the stairs at the side of the stage. A security guard started to move toward me, but he stopped. "Why?" Because Avery Cole had just stood up in the third row. Avery did not look like a guest. She looked like an executioner. She was holding a thick black file folder. She walked toward the stage from the other side, flanking Leonard. The security guard looked between the CEO and the two women in power suits, and his instinct for self-preservation kicked in. He stepped back. I walked up the stairs and stood 5 feet away from my father. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. I could smell the expensive scotch seeping out of his pores. The representatives from Triaxis, seated at a long table to the right of the stage, were on their feet. They were whispering frantically to each other. The deal was dying in front of their eyes. I turned to the audience. I treated them like a jury. "My name is Gemma Carter," I said, my voice steady. "I am the director of compliance for this company. On the night of April 2nd, I was involved in a car accident. I arrived at the hospital with a traumatic brain injury. Leonard tried to interrupt. He tried to shout over me, claiming this was a private family matter, but the audio technician, confused by the chaos or perhaps realizing this was the most interesting thing to happen in that room in years, did not cut my mic. In fact, someone had handed me a handheld microphone from the panel table. I took it. "The attending neurosurgeon gave me a 70% chance of a full recovery," I said, looking directly at the investors. 70%. Those are better odds than any stock you have bought this year." There was a murmur of nervous laughter and shock. "But my father did not like those odds," I continued, "because if I lived, my $15 million trust fund stayed with me. If I died, it went to him. He needed that money to plug the holes in the Blake Hope Foundation before this merger closed." "Lies," Leonard screamed. He was losing control. He looked wild. "She is mentally unstable. Cut the feed. Cut the damn feed." "He signed a do not resuscitate order 4 hours after my accident," I said, speaking over him. "He refused life-saving surgery. He ordered the doctors to let me die. Proof? A reporter shouted from the back. Do you have proof? I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile. I do, I said. I nodded to Avery. Avery was standing at the audio-visual console at the side of the stage. She had commandeered the laptop that was running the presentation. She held up a standard auxiliary cable. Leonard saw the cable. He saw the phone in her hand, and for the first time, he realized the trap. He lunged toward her. Stop her, he shrieked. That is privileged. That is illegal. He was too slow. Avery plugged the cable in. She pressed play. The sound system of the Regency Crown Hotel was state-of-the-art. It was designed to project the clarity of a symphony orchestra. Now, it projected the sterile, terrifying silence of an intensive care unit. The sound of a heart monitor filled the ballroom. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm was hypnotic. It was the sound of a life hanging in the balance. Then, a voice cut through the beeping. It was unmistakably Leonard Blake's voice. There was no distortion. It was the voice of the man standing on the stage, but stripped of the charm, stripped of the public persona. What happens if we do not operate? If we just let her pass? The ballroom gasped. Leonard stood frozen. He looked like a statue made of ash. The recording continued. Let her pass. We will not pay for the surgery. The trust reverts to me. It is the practical choice. It is the practical choice. The words echoed off the gold leaf ceiling. They bounced off the crystal chandeliers. They slammed into the ears of 200 people who had just applauded this man's speech about compassion. The trust will be more useful in the foundation than in a vegetative daughter. The recording ended. The only sound left was the beep, beep, beep of the monitor, which Avery let play for 10 more seconds. It was the sound of the daughter he tried to kill, haunting the empire he tried to build. I lowered the microphone. I looked at Leonard. He was trembling. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to grip the podium to keep from collapsing. He looked out at the crowd, searching for an ally, searching for a friendly face. He found none. The Triaxis executives were packing their briefcases. The investors were typing furiously on their phones sell orders, all of them. The reporters were shouting questions, a wall of noise that hit him like a physical wave. I took one step closer to him. I was close enough to hear his shallow, panicked breathing. You wanted a revolution in patient care, Dad, I said, my voice low, just for him and the microphone. You just got one. I turned my back on him. I looked at the camera, at the red light that was beaming this moment to the world, and I knew that somewhere, a federal agent was watching. Somewhere, a board member was opening the encrypted file Avery had sent. Somewhere, the stock price of Blakeline Health Alliance was beginning a freefall that would never hit bottom. The room erupted into chaos, but I stood in the center of the storm, perfectly calm. The prop had become the protagonist, and the man who thought he was a king was just a criminal standing in front of a crowd that now knew exactly what his soul cost, $15 million, and he had lost it all. The silence that followed the recording was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually occurs right after a bomb detonates. In that split second before the debris starts to fall, the ballroom of the Regency Crown Hotel, usually a place of polite applause and clinking glasses, had become a crime scene. Janice Rowe broke the silence. Janice was a small woman with gray hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing a tweed jacket that looked like it belonged in a university lecture hall rather than a corporate gala. She was a professor of bioethics and the one member of the board Leonard had always dismissed as a necessary nuisance. He kept her around to make the company look responsible, never imagining she would one day hold the axe. She stood up from table 4. She did not look at me. She looked directly at the chairman of the board, a man named Arthur Sterling, who was currently turning a shade of pale, usually reserved for corpses. Mr. Chairman, Janice said, her voice projected clearly without a microphone. I am formally invoking Article 4, Section 9 of the Blakeline Corporate Bylaws. I am calling for an immediate emergency session of the Board of Directors to to address gross medical ethics violations committed by the Chief Executive Officer. The phrase gross medical ethics violations hung in the air like smoke. Leonard snapped out of his paralysis. He grabbed the microphone, his hands shaking so violently that the feedback squealed through the speakers. "This is absurd!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Sit down, Janice. This is a family misunderstanding. That recording is taken out of context." I was under extreme duress. I was weighing all the scenarios for the good of the hospital. He turned to the crowd, his eyes wild, pleading. "You have to understand, a CEO has to make hard choices. I was thinking about the merger. I was thinking about the thousands of employees whose jobs depend on this deal closing. I was trying to protect the legacy. I stepped forward. I did not need to shout. I just held up the phone connected to the audio cable. Context, I asked. Leonard, that was a 30-second clip. I have the full 22 minutes right here. Do you want me to play the part where you told Dr. Calder that you would ruin her career if she did not sign the order? Do you want me to play the part where you asked if the $15 million could be transferred before the time of death was officially called? Leonard froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He knew exactly what was on that tape. He knew that if I played the rest, there would be no defense, no spin, no misunderstanding. There would only be prison. But there was someone else on that stage who looked like he was about to vomit. Ethan. My brother had been standing in the shadows of the wings, ready to come out and shake hands for the photo op. Now, he was frozen in the spotlight spill. I looked at him. I tapped the screen of the phone. Or maybe, I said, looking directly at my brother. We should listen to the part where the witness speaks. I hit play again. The audio system crackled. Leonard's voice receded, and another voice spoke up. It was younger, hesitant, but clear. She once told me she wouldn't want to live like that. She said being a vegetable was her worst nightmare. I think Dad is right. The recording stopped. The room turned to look at Ethan. I saw the blood drain from his face. He gripped the velvet curtain next to him for support. It was a lie. A blatant, verifiable lie. I had never said that to him. In fact, 6 months ago, when we were discussing living wills during a legal audit, I had told him explicitly that I wanted every aggressive measure taken. I had told him I would fight to the last breath. He knew it, and yet, he had stood in that ICU, looked at his father signing a death warrant for cash, and he had handed him the pen. Ethan looked at me, his eyes filling with tears of terror. He saw the realization on my face. He realized that I wasn't just taking down our father, I was burning the whole house down, and he was trapped inside. The representative from Triaxis, a tall man with the demeanor of a shark who smells blood in the water, stood up. He didn't even look at Leonard. He looked at his legal team, nodded once, and then turned to the microphone at his table. Triaxis is suspending all activities regarding this merger immediately, he announced. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Pending a full clarification of the serious ethical and criminal concerns regarding Blakeline leadership, we are withdrawing our offer. You can't do that, Leonard screamed. He left the podium and ran toward the edge of the stage. We have a contract. The papers are ready. This is just a disruption. Security, get her off the stage. The security guards did not move. They were hired muscle. Yes, but they were not stupid. They looked at the board members standing up. They looked at the furious investors. They looked at the woman in the navy suit who had just commanded the room with a cell phone. They folded their arms and stayed exactly where they were. Board members, Janice Rowe said, her voice cutting through the chaos. The green room, now. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. 9 people stood up from the VIP tables. 3 of them were Leonard's cronies, men who had profited from his corruption for years. They looked terrified. They looked at their phones, watching the stock price begin to tick downward, and I could see the loyalty leaving their bodies. In the corporate world, loyalty has a price tag, and Leonard Blake had just become a liability that no amount of past favors could cover. They marched out of the ballroom into a small, private conference room adjacent to the stage. The door closed with a heavy thud, sealing them off from the noise of the reporters who were now shouting questions at the empty podium. I stayed on the stage. I did not follow them. I didn't need to. Avery had already sent the digital packets to their tablets. They had the evidence. They had the flowcharts of the money laundering. They had the proof of the HIPAA violations. They had the truth. Inside that room, I knew exactly what was happening. It was a boardroom drama playing out at warp speed. Victor Hale, the representative for the institutional investors, would be speaking first. He wouldn't talk about morality. He would talk about exposure. He would tell them that the SEC was likely already opening a file based on the live stream. He would tell them that if they didn't cut Leonard loose immediately, they could all be named as co-defendants in the shareholder lawsuits that would be filed by noon. Janice Rowe would follow. She would lay out the bylaws. She would remind them that gross medical ethics violations was a cause for termination without severance. She would show them the nursing affidavits that proved Leonard had lied to the board about my condition for a week. Leonard's 3 friends, Arthur, David, and Simon, would try to argue for a suspension, a leave of absence, something to save face. But Victor would pull up the stock ticker. I checked my own phone. Blakeline stock had dropped 12% in the last 10 minutes. It was in freefall. Trading had been halted on the exchange due to volatility. The only way to stop the bleeding was a human sacrifice. The meeting lasted exactly 14 minutes. When the door opened, the silence in the ballroom returned. Everyone knew that the verdict had been reached. Janice Rowe walked out first. She looked grim but determined. Behind her came Arthur Sterling, the chairman. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Leonard did not walk out with them. Arthur stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the floor. "Effective immediately," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "The board of directors has voted to remove Leonard Blake from his position as chief executive officer of Blakeline Health Alliance." A gasp went through the room, followed by the frantic clacking of laptop keyboards as reporters filed their urgent alerts. "Mr. Blake has been stripped of all executive authority," Arthur continued. "Furthermore, the board has voted to fully cooperate with federal authorities regarding allegations of financial impropriety within the Blake Hope Foundation. An interim CEO will be named within the hour." It was a slaughter. It was clean, brutal, and total. Then, the door to the green room opened again. Leonard stumbled out. He was not wearing his jacket. His tie was loosened. His face was a mask of shock. He looked at the room he had paid for, the people he had invited, the empire he had built, and he realized he was a ghost. He looked at me. I was still standing near the edge of the stage. Our eyes met. There was no love in his eyes. There was no regret. There was only the pure, distilled hatred of a narcissist who had been bested by the one person he deemed inferior. He mouthed a word at me. I think it was ingrate. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just watched him. The head of security, a man named Miller, who had worked for Leonard for 15 years, walked up to him. Miller didn't offer a hand. He didn't call him Mr. Blake. "Sir," Miller said, his voice loud enough for the front row to hear, "I need to ask you to vacate the premises. You are no longer an authorized representative of the company." "This is my hotel," Leonard spat. "I rented this ballroom." "The company rented it, sir," Miller said. "And you are not the company anymore." Miller gestured to 2 other guards. They flanked Leonard. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it was an escort. It was the walk of shame. As they led him down the stairs, the cameras flashed in a strobe light frenzy. Every step he took was documented. The image of Leonard Blake, the Titan of the Midwest, being led away by his own guards would be on the front page of every newspaper in the country tomorrow. He passed Ethan, who was still cowering by the curtain. Leonard didn't look at his son. He didn't try to save him. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the exit doors, trying to maintain a shred of dignity that had evaporated the moment he signed that DNR. The Triaxis team was already gone. Their table was empty. The stock ticker on the side screen, which someone had forgotten to turn off, showed Blakeline down 35%. The empire hadn't just crumbled, it had turned to ash. I looked out at the sea of faces. They weren't looking at Leonard anymore. They were looking at me. They were wondering what the woman who had just decapitated a king would do next. I didn't smile. There was no joy in this. This wasn't a celebration. It was a demolition. I walked over to Avery, who was closing the laptop. She looked at me and gave a small, tired nod. "It is done," she whispered. "Not yet," I said. "The feds are still waiting for the files." "Sent," Avery said. "2 minutes ago. The DOJ has the full package. The insider trading, the charity fraud, the wire transfers. They will be knocking on his door before he gets home." I looked back at the empty podium. The logo of Blakeline was still on the screen, but it looked different now. It didn't look like a symbol of power. It looked like a target. I had destroyed the company I loved to save the patients it exploited. I had destroyed my family to save myself. The room began to clear out. People murmuring, rushing to phones, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. I stood alone on the stage for a moment longer, feeling the heat of the lights. I touched the scar hidden under my hair, the place where my head had hit the dashboard, the place where Leonard had bet I would never wake up. He bet wrong. I turned and walked down the stairs, past the stunned investors, past the frantic reporters. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I was walking out of the wreckage, leaving the smoke and the ruin behind me. The merger was dead, the money was safe, and Leonard Blake was finished. But as I reached the doors, I knew there was one scene left to play, one final confrontation before the police cars arrived. He wouldn't go home. He wouldn't run. He would come for me. He would want to know why, and I would be waiting. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the morning had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in my bones. My apartment in Riverton was quiet. It was a space of clean lines and muted colors, a sanctuary I had bought with my own salary 3 years ago, deliberately choosing a building that the Blake Real Estate Holding Company did not own. I needed one place on earth where I was just Gemma, not the CEO's daughter. I had not turned on the lights. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain streak against the glass. The city below was a grid of blurred gold and red lights, indifferent to the corporate empire that had collapsed in its center just hours ago. I knew he was coming. I did not need a security alert to tell me. I felt it, the connection between a parent and child. Even a relationship as poisoned as ours carries a certain gravity. He had nowhere else to go. The police would be at his mansion. The reporters would be swarming the hospital. His club membership had likely been revoked by dinner time, at 11 o'clock at night. The chime of my private elevator sounded. I did not move. I kept my back to the room, watching the reflection in the glass. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. Leonard Blake walked into my living room. He had bypassed the doorman. He had likely used the old head of security, a man he had hired 20 years ago, to override the lock. It was the last favor he would ever receive in this town. I turned around slowly. The man standing on my Persian rug was not the titan of industry who had commanded the ballroom that morning. He was a ruin. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in 10 hours. His bespoke Italian suit was rumpled and stained with rain. His tie hung loose around his neck like a noose he had forgotten to tighten. His hair, usually sprayed into helmet-like perfection, was plastered to his forehead, but it was his eyes that terrified me. They were red, rimmed with the raw inflammation of sleeplessness and unshed tears. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into the sun and gone blind. He did not speak at first. He walked to the wet bar in the corner of the room, his movements stiff and jerky. He poured himself a drink from my decanter without asking. His hands shook so badly that the crystal neck clattered against the glass. He drank it in one swallow and gasped. "They froze the accounts," he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its booming authority. "Everything, the personal checking, the offshore holdings, even the credit cards. I could not even pay the cab driver. I had to give him my watch." I said nothing. I just watched him. He turned to face me. He looked around the apartment, taking in the modest furniture, the lack of ostentation. He sneered. a ghost of his old arrogance surfacing for a second. "You always lived like a pauper," he muttered. $15 million waiting for you, and you live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the warehouse district. "It is paid for," I said calmly. "And it is mine," he laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He slumped into the armchair near the window, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked at his hands. "I did not want to do it. Gemma," he whispered. I felt a spike of anger so hot it nearly choked me. But I pushed it down. I stayed in the ice. "Do not lie to me, Leonard," I said. "Not here. The cameras are gone. The jury is gone. It is just us." He looked up at me, and his face crumpled. The mask fell away completely, revealing a terrified, desperate old man. "I owe money," he said. The confession spilled out of him like bile. "Not to the bank. The banks cut me off 6 months ago. I owe money to people who do not send late notices. I owe them $30 million. I stared at him. 30 million. It was a staggering sum, even for a man of his wealth. "Gambling?" I asked. He nodded shamefully. "After your mother died, I needed to feel something, anything. Risk made me feel alive. I leveraged the company stock. I bet on futures. Then I started playing at the underground tables in Macau and Vegas. I lost. Gemma, I lost everything. I leveraged the house. I leveraged the foundation." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "They gave me a deadline. The merger was supposed to cover it. I was going to use the signing bonus to pay them off before anyone knew, but the liquidity was tight. I needed a bridge loan. I needed cash to show the auditors that the foundation was solvent." He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You were the bridge, Gemma. You were the only asset I had left that was liquid." I listened to him rationalize his crime. He was trying to paint himself as a victim of grief, a man driven to madness by the loss of his wife. But I knew the timeline. My mother had been dead for 12 years. He hadn't started stealing from the foundation until 3 years ago. This wasn't grief. This was greed masked as tragedy. "So you did the math," I said. "My life was worth 15 million. Your debt was 30 million. I was a down payment." "I thought you wouldn't feel it," he cried out, standing up and taking a step toward me. "You were in a coma." "The doctors said it was bad," I told myself. I told myself that if you passed, it would be peaceful. You would go to be with your mother, and I would survive, if I didn't pay them. "Gemma, they were going to kill me. They sent me photos of you. They threatened to hurt you to get to me." He was sobbing now, ugly, heaving sobs that shook his entire frame. "I was trying to save us," he lied. "I was trying to save the family name." I walked over to him. I stood toe to toe with the man who had raised me. I smelled the scotch and the fear on him. "Stop," I said. My voice was not loud, but it stopped his crying instantly. "You had a choice," I said, cutting through his hysteria. "You had a choice, your life or mine. You signed the paper so mine would end first. That is not desperation. Dad, that is a decision." He flinched as if I had slapped him. "You traded my breath for your safety," I continued, my voice hard as flint. "You stood in that room, looked at my broken body, and you didn't see a daughter. You saw a check. Don't you dare tell me you did it to protect me." He fell back into the chair. He ran his hands through his hair, ruining the last remnants of his composure. He tried to pivot. He tried to find a moral high ground where none existed. "It wasn't just the debt," he stammered. The money in the foundation really does good work. Gemma, we built the pediatric wing. We funded the oncology research. If the company goes down, all that goes away, those children. I was thinking about the greater good. $15 million in your trust fund sits there doing nothing. In the foundation, it could have saved 1,000 lives. I laughed. It was a harsh, humorless sound. "I saw the ledgers, Dad," I said. "I saw the transfers to Gemini Vantage. I saw the payments to the shell companies in the Caymans. You haven't funded a single cancer study in 4 years. You used the foundation as a laundromat for your gambling debts. You never read the name of a single patient you claimed to help. To you, They were just props for your annual report, just like I was a prop for your speech this morning." He stared at me, his mouth open. He realized then that I knew everything. There was no corner of his deception that I had not illuminated. I had stripped him naked. He slid off the chair. He fell to his knees on the rug. It was a pathetic sight. The great Leonard Blake, kneeling at the feet of the daughter he had dismissed as weak. He grabbed the hem of my jacket. "Gemma," he begged, "is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can do to make this right?" He was looking for a deal, even now, at the end of the world. He was trying to negotiate. He wanted to know if I would recant, if I would tell the police that I was confused, that the recording was a misunderstanding. He wanted to know if he could trade his dignity for his freedom. I looked down at him. I felt a strange sense of detachment. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate requires energy. Hate implies a connection. I just felt a profound, icy indifference. "No," I said. I pulled my jacket from his grip. "I am not going to help you," I said. "I have already handed over the files to the Department of Justice. I have given the SEC the trading logs. I have given the medical board the recording. You are going to prison, Leonard, for a very long time." He slumped forward, his forehead touching the rug. He let out a low moan of despair. "And as for the money," I said, my voice turning steel, "the $15 million is mine. It stays mine, but I'm not going to let it sit there." He looked up, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "I am going to take over the foundation," I told him. "I am going to fire your board. I am going to clear out the rot, and I am going to use every cent of my mother's money to fix the damage you did. I will fund the clinics you closed. I will hire back the nurses you fired. I will make Blakeline actually stand for healing." I leaned down, my face inches from his. "But I will not do it in your name," I whispered. "Your name is going to be scrubbed from the building. Your legacy will be nothing but a case study in law schools about corporate greed." I stood up and walked to the door. I opened it wide. The harsh yellow light of the hallway spilled into the dim apartment. "Get out," I said. He struggled to his feet. He looked at me one last time, waiting for a reprieve, waiting for the daughter who used to bring him coffee to surface. But she was gone. She had died in the accident, or perhaps she had died the moment he signed the DNR. "Gemma," he started, "you taught me contracts." "Dad," I cut him off. "You taught me that actions have clauses. You taught me that everything has a price." I pointed to the door. "You signed your contract in an ICU at 2 a.m, I said. "Now you have to pay the penalty." He looked at the open door. He looked at the darkness of the hallway. He knew that the moment he stepped over that threshold, he was no longer Leonard Blake, CEO. He was just a broken old man facing a federal indictment. He walked toward the door. His step was heavy, shuffling. He passed me without a word. He stepped out into the corridor. The light swallowed him. I did not watch him walk to the elevator. I closed the door. The click of the latch was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a knot being cut. I locked the deadbolt. I walked back to the living room. I picked up the glass he had drunk from and carried it to the sink. I washed it. I dried it. I put it away. Then I walked to the dining table. Spread out across the surface were the files, the transcripts, the affidavits, the trust documents, the paper trail of my revenge. I picked up the folder labeled Blake Estate. I closed it. I turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, save for the city lights outside. I stood there in the quiet, breathing in the air that was mine, in the life that I had fought for, in the future that I now owned completely. He tried to turn my coma into capital. I turned his empire into evidence. That is the only kind of inheritance I am willing to accept. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Gemma's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can reach even more listeners. Your support means the world to us.